Hello and welcome a lesson on group policy management. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create, or not actually create, how to deal with or navigate around the group policy objects and what to do with them, how do they flow, how do they control for security purposes, control the users or even the computers and how to apply them and things like that. So this is probably one of the most difficult chapters or lessons of all of the Server 2012. So hopefully I'll break it down and make it a little bit easier for you. And we'll do a little bit of practice on the server itself. We'll see how it works. Okay, so before we even begin, let me just explain to you what is the group policy objects. So Microsoft actually did a whole bunch of objects, almost thousands of them, different group policy objects. So if you take one of them and you can place it inside on top of, let's say, a container, and once you place it on that container, linking it, I also say apply it. Well, we use the word link. Once we link it to that container, everything that is underneath that container, computers and users will inherit these that policy. So they'll have to follow that policy. For example, if there's a policy that says you cannot save files on the hard drive, for example, um, and you placed it on the New Jersey users, the New Jersey users will not, when they log in, they will not be able, all the New Jersey users will not be able to save files on the hard drive. Just an example, right? So I wrote some notes that I will want to give you, but this is really a breakdown of what it looks like. Let's just go to, let me break this down into two halves so you'll see the notes while we're doing our server. So let's log into our server and take a look at how it looks like on the server side. So let's just do Control Alt Delete and get into our server. When you get into our server, uh, well, I've been playing around. First thing that you want to do is you want to go to Group Policy Management. Okay, so when you go to Group Policy Management, okay, you'll see your forest. When you open that up, you'll see domains, sites, which we really don't have. So you can expand that if you want to. There's something called group policy modeling, which we'll talk about later on, and group policy results. Again, we'll discuss that later. Okay, expand the domain. You'll see our domain, the xyz.local domain. Expand that. And you'll see our a default domain policy. Expand the domain controller. And there's another container, which is really not a container, the group policy object container. Okay, this is where all the objects are going to be. Any GP, let's call them GP from now on. GPO stands for group policy object, and whenever I say GP, I mean group policy. So anytime you want to create a GPO, it's going to go in here. All right, when you pull one, and then you have to link it to one in here. For example, there's two default objects, two default GPOs, the default domain controller policy and the default domain policy. And both of these are in here, and both of them are linked. This one is linked. The default domain policy is linked to our domain, which means whatever settings that are in this domain is going to flow all the way down to these objects. There's another default domain controller policy. Whatever settings in this domain, in this GPO, it will flow to all the containers below. So in the New Jersey, the New Jersey organizational units are going to apply both settings of the default default domain and the default domain controller policies. Okay, if both of them conflict, the last one will also, if they have the same, It'll be the addition of both settings, even if both have the same settings. For example, don't save anything on the hard drive, for example. Okay. Um, so that's basically how it works. You bring up a domain policy, and then you link it to a container if you want. If you delete one, then it will not be deleted from here. If you remember when we did access control lists for a firewall, you create the access list and you save it on the router, but then you have to apply it. This is the same idea. Here you create the GPOs under the group policy objects, and then you have to link it. If you just don't do anything with them, they'll be just sitting there, and you can link them later on if you want to. But if you're not linking them, they don't take effect. You can remove them from the link, but they'll stay under the group policy. This is where they are housed. Okay, you can delete them from in here too. Okay, so let's take a look at inside. Let me just click on one of them. Let's click on the default domain policy. Let me just, you know what? Click on the default domain policy. Okay. We'll be able to talk about the authentication users, the DMI, WMI filtering, the security filtering. We'll talk about that later on. But if you go to settings, okay, this is what the default domain policy settings are. Let's show all of them. Okay, so this is it's a policy that on the computer configuration, it's asking you to, for example, enforce password history, maximum password age. So that's what all the setting on this policy, that computer, any computer in here will have to follow these settings. It's just for computer configuration. If you right click and go to edit, and you see there are two configurations that you could do to this policy. All policies will have two configurations. One computer configuration and the other is user. So the default domain policy has the following configuration. There's policies and there are preferences. Policies are, since the 2003, we only had policies. In 2008 and 2012 servers, they came up with something called preferences. And the only thing that really I can explain to you is preferences. In the old days, you really had, if you wanted something something that it was not in the policy and you want it to be applied to a specific container, you have to write some sort of a script. But in 2008 and 2012, they did all of that. They put that all under references. So it's really kind of an extension to what policies are. We're not going to be doing as much of them. So for example, under computer configurations, you can go to, this is for software. If you are installing any software, you're probably not going to do much. Under Windows settings, so you'll see here's a whole bunch of deployed. But if you go under administrative template, let me just expand this a little bit, extend this out a little bit. By the way, you could have clicked on it from here. So there's a whole bunch of them. Whoops. And if you go, let's say, to control panel, I'm just giving you an example. And let's say for user accounts, under user account, there's one. Here is one GPO. Here's one setting. And let's say under regional and language, there's three settings. Under personalization, there's three settings. All of these settings are not configured. You want them to be enabled. If they are enabled, they will take effect. So almost every single GPO that you create will have all of these, but none of them will be enabled. You go in and you click on which one you want, then that GPO will be enabled. So if I take that GPO and none of them are enabled and I put it up here under New Jersey, I create, let's say, a GPO and I put it right in here and nothing is enabled, it's not going to affect anything unless I click something else. But here, you know what? Let's create a GPO. All right, so I want you to let's go to group policy objects. Let's just create one. Right click on it and create new. And here's let's call it new test GPO, let's call it. No, not new test GPO. A source starter GPO. So I have, if you click on this, you should not see anything, but I enabled it. But we'll talk about that later on. You can enable the starter GPOs from here. Click on them, but you see there are old starter GPOs for old computers. You can download some of these off the internet if you wanted to, but we'll leave it at none. We don't want any starter GPOs. You could actually download them. So, and you click on OK. There's the new test GPO. It has all of these settings. So right click on it. By the way, we just created it. None of the settings in this GPO, there's like thousands of them. None of them are enabled. So even if I apply it to any of these containers on the top, nothing is going to happen. So what you can do is you can go, let's say well, first of all, let's do some settings. Let's go to the editor. Let's edit that new setting. And let's say I want to go to user configuration. That's when a user logs in. Let's go to administrative template down here. Expand this a little bit. Let me go to control panel. Let me go to, let's say, add and remove programs. And let's say I want to remove and add programs, right? So I want this setting to be enabled. That's the only thing I want out of this whole thing, out of this whole GPO that I just created. So I double click on that. Actually, before, if you just click on it, it gives you an explanation. What's the requirement of the PC for this to be active and all of that. If you double click on it, this is what the actual setting is. One setting out of thousands in that GPO. They're all okay. There are three things that you see in there. There is not configured, which means that this setting has not been changed. Nobody modified it, or you leave it the way it is. Don't change anything. And they'll explain to you in here. You can add and remove, let users install, uninstall, repair, or add and remove features or components, or blah 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 blah, all that good stuff. That's if it's if it's enabled. Or I'm sorry, if it's enabled, you're going to prevent users from adding and removing programs, right? If it's disabled, so that means you are not allowing. That means student will be able to do that. Okay, do not do what this is saying. That's what disabled mean, which means you are going to allow users to add and remove programs. So I'm going to enable it. Okay, and I'm going to say apply, and I'm going to say okay. And as you can see, it's enabled. So my new test GPO has this setting in it. Everything else is not configured, which means really nothing is not, they're not enabled. And the configuration has not been changed. That's what not configured means. All right. So if I go now, if I get out of the editor, right, and now this new test GPO, we know it has a setting that will not allow users to add and remove programs. So I can put it under, I can right click over the users, and I'm going to link the existing GPO. Which one do I want? I want the new test. So I new test, and I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to ask you to print screen this before we continue. So print screen the screen so I know that you know how to link a GPO to a container. And you click on OK, and now you can see that this new test has been linked to the New Jersey users. And now it's going to be applied. If there's any users in there, nobody will be able to add and remove programs. There are other things that you can make changes to the new test GPO if you wanted to. How do you delete it? Just right click. If you delete a GPO, you click on delete, and it's gone. But the new test GPO will still be in here. You can get rid of that too as well if you wanted to. Okay, so that's basically how you can get to the GPO itself and how to create one, what they are. So just remember, you create the GPO. The GPO has thousands, I want to say, of settings. You got to find out which settings that you want to do. Basically, what you do, you create your GPO. This is what you got to think about. Then you go to, after you create the GPO under the group policy object, you go to edit. Then you got to think about, do I want to do something to the computer, or do I want to do something to the user that is going to be using that computer? So if you want to go do something to the computer itself, you go under computer configuration, and most likely you are going to go to the administrative template. That's the best place to go. So go in there and find out. Here's all the settings. You can click on all the settings under the computer. Let me move this over and find something that you want to that computer. Look at it. Look at it. Hundreds of settings. Turn on, turn off, all of that, right? Do me a favor. Take another screenshot of this because I want you to know. Once you turn on, enable any of these settings on that GPO, then you can link into any of the containers on the top. All right, so take a screenshot of this. And then underneath those two screenshots, I want you to say, type in the following. Number one, you create the GPO under the group policy object container. And once you do that, then you right click and go to editor, edit that GPO, and then you decide if you want to do computer configuration or user configuration, depending on what you decide to. You go to policies, most likely, and then under administrative template, you're writing all that down, go to all settings and pick which settings you want to enable. Once you are done, then you have to apply that GPO to a container. That's basically the steps, believe it or not. All right? Hopefully you got all that. If not, I want you to pause and write everything that we just talked about. Okay, so let me close that. Let me, you can get it. Oops, let me just get out of this for now. I want you to go to the starter GPOs. I know I had these already. When you don't have these, click on them. Let's go, and you'll have them expanded. Like I said again, you can download. These are old starter GPOs. You can go on Microsoft and download some of these, or you can actually get on the internet, but you probably don't need any of these. Okay, let me go back to this, to our notes. So I broke these down as the domain. Remember, there is a default domain policy that's being applied. In general, you do not want to really play around with the default. Don't change the default domain policies. Leave them as is, unless you really know what you're doing. Okay, so remember, another thing is the group policy object is not really a container, but that holds all the GPOs, linked or not linked, right? When a GPO links to a container, it will affect all the users and computers underneath that, depending on what the settings on that GPO is. A good practice is to never edit the GPO. I said that already, I think. When editing a GPO, remember, it will affect all the containers that is linked to it. So once you go in the group policy objects and you pick one GPO and you try to edit it, if that policy was linked to a whole bunch of different containers, all those containers that was linked to changes, will happen to them immediately, right? So I also broke down, when you edit, you'll have computer configuration and policy configuration, right? The software settings is really for software deployment. The administrative template, this is what you're going to be using the most, right? The policies for user, when the user goes in to log in, not the computer itself, who the user is and what's going to happen when the user logged in. That's what the policies are going to be for that specific user. When they log in, are they going to be denied or permitted to do certain things, right? Looking back at some of these, just quickly going back to our server. Let me just minimize this. Hopefully this is not too confusing. All right. So basically, sites, we don't have any sites. You can actually place GPOs on sites. WMI filtering is really basically is you are setting up a specific filtering depending on the hardware. I think I wrote that somewhere. So when it comes to WMI, is GPs depending on the hardware. So let's say if the if the PC has a certain amount of memory or hard drive space, then you apply this GPO. Okay, so for example, if I go to this test GPO and I go right here, there's nothing in there. So you can actually set that up. You can link it depending on the hardware. Okay, so that's what the WMI for. Um, I don't think you're going to work as much with that. But what else do you need to know? Group policy modeling and policy results. We'll talk about that later on in the next sections. When I broke that into three different sections. Okay, so that's the basics of the GPO. Okay, now let's look at the infrastructure of the group policy. So the group policies are applied or linked, I should say, or executed, better word, in the following order. You first execute if there's a local GPO on a container or a user, you do that first. You always do the local on the local machine, whatever the GPO on the local machine, you'll do that first. Then you do the site, then you do the domain, then you do the organizational unit. That's how the order is. Now, depending on what the settings are, the last setting wins. So depending if there was a setting previously that says deny something, and the setting after that came and says permit that something, permit is going to win. Always what just like when if you're taking an exam and the last and you get three chances to take the test, but the last grade counts, not the lowest, not the highest. The last. This is the same idea, but this is the order that is the GPOs are executed. So the last GPO settings on the object of the container will be the active, or so they call it the winning GPO. To see all the settings that are configured and enabled on the policy, all you have to do is go to settings. We did that already. So you saw what the GPO settings are, and you just pick any of the settings to either enable or disable, or just leave them the way they are. The group policy results. Okay, so you want to know what the actual results are of the policy. So what happens? So when you go to results down here, this will generate. Let me say you can right click on it, go create a policy result wizard. So let's just say you want to do. Let's do next. Um, let's do it on this computer. Okay, or you can do it on another computer. Let's do it on this computer and the current user, or you can specific a specific user. I don't, nobody ever logged in on this computer, so I'll leave it like that. And you click next. So it's generating a report for me, and here's the report. The report is going to come up, and here's what that GPO. Okay, the GPO policy that's been set. It really during last, no errors, blah blah blah. It creates and no. So depending on where I am in here, I'm in the administrators under the, on okay, um, and I have already applied. I already have under the users, actually in here somewhere. All of these policies have been applied to me, and this is what the results are. It's going to tell me if anything happens, something is wrong, you were locked out. So what the results are, right? So this is if I think when I gave you the notes in here, it's to show a report of what the settings were applied on a user or a computer. It also shows the winning GPO, the last GPO. So depending on where I was, and if I'm in different containers, this is going to show you all the summaries of all the different settings that were applied to me. So you can look at the details of it if you wanted to, and how they've been applied. and the policy events, all of that. Okay? So click back on summary and please take a screenshot of this. I want to see that you know. Remember the group policy results, telling you the result to a specific user logging in onto a specific machine, for example, and what the result is, what the result of all the different settings from all the different GPOs, right? So take a snapshot of this. Policy modeling, that's really nice. That's something nice to do because what you could do here, if somebody calls you and says, I'm having problem accessing so and so. Do you know what's the problem? So you know what? I can do right click. Let me do a test before I give them an answer. So I can run a wizard. This is a what if kind of. So let's say this available domain controller running Windows 2003. Let's say this. I want to do it on this domain controller. You can browse. Um, Well, I can use that. Let's choose a container and let's use domain controllers. I'm sorry, let's use the New Jersey in here and let's pick New Jersey. What the hell? Just for practice anyway. And it says simulate policy implementation. You can simulate if it was a slow network, if there's a slow connections, it can tell you that you have a problem. Loop processing, we'll talk about that later on. The site, you can default the first site, so we're not going to even bother that. You can skip and go to the final page if you want to, but let's go into the details. You can say for all authenticated users, the ones that are authenticated, that means they typed in their password correctly, or anyone that logs in, right? So let's leave it at authenticated users. Let's do a test also on the computer settings group, also for authenticated users. The DOMI filters, all the links, or you can put any links that you want in there, and so on. So you have a lot of choices that you could do. And now it's going to generate a report for you. This is what would happen. This is just a testing, a scenario that you can come up with. And it will tell you for XYZ on New York, and here's the details of it. Okay? And then like somebody gave you the scenario and then you can go in there, test it out and see what the problem might be. This is just doing a quick test. It's not live. And then you can say, if I change this and if I change this setting and I test it again and if it works, then I can create a GPO and then apply it. So this is really an area for the group policy to test out a scenario before you apply the GPO, right? All right, so do me a favor, click back on summary and take a snapshot of this so you'll know what the group policy modeling is. All right, going back to our notes. So I wrote the group policy modeling is to simulate a specific scenario and see what happens. That's perfect for troubleshooting. If somebody gives you a problem and tells you, they're having a problem, go and simulate it. Go to the group policy modeling, put that in there and see what happens. They'll tell you exactly which setting is affecting what and which is the winning setting. And then you can play around and fix that problem from there, right? Now, once you create a setting and you make changes to settings on a GPO, it's not going to take effect. If you go to the command prompt and type GP update and hit enter, most of the time you will force the update to happen immediately. That's like refreshing the update. Sometimes if it's a user-based setting, then you need to log off and log back on for it to take effect. If it's a computer-based setting, then you probably have to reboot. Okay? So that's with the infrastructure. Okay, so going back in here, now we need to look at, let me see if I want to make sure that I, covered everything we need to do. Yes, we did. Let's look at the exceptions. Okay, let's look at, let me just minimize all of this because hopefully A lot of this is, I know there's a lot of information. You can look at all the settings. Let me tell you right now, not everybody knows all these settings. It's impossible for everybody to remember all of these settings that are inside these GPOs. You just need to, like I told you earlier, you got to go to all settings and look at which ones. And you'll, once you play around with this a little bit, then you have an idea of what you need to do. You know exactly where to go. You just got to play around with it a little bit once you get familiar with it. But you don't have to remember all of that stuff. Okay, so let's look at the exceptions. There are sub exceptions to the rules that we've talked about. Remember, we talked about that the rule is the GPOs are applied to the following order: local, site, domain, and then the organizational unit. Well, there are some exceptions to that. All right, but remember this: don't use exceptions unless you know what you're doing. Okay, because that will affect users and it will affect a lot of this is only an exception. That's why I wrote that down. Only use them if you really know that you do not want certain things, for example, to happen, or you want to make some changes. Let's look at the block inheritance. So what this means is the container will not accept any policies from above. So if something is flowing down, so let's look at here. I'm sorry, let's go right into our containers. So let's look at our domains. And let me just bring this domain. So if I go right into New Jersey, right click on New Jersey, and I say block inheritance, what does that do? You see that little sign right there? I want you to right click and take a shot of this. Take a screenshot. Block inheritance, if you see that question mark, that means all these two default policies with their settings will not go through New Jersey. So everything will be blocked. And then I'm going to create my own GPO and link it here. And only the linked GPO will have effect to everything underneath. That's what blocked inheritance means. Of course, I don't recommend that. So let me unblock that. Okay, so that's an exception that you could do. The other one is enforced inheritance. This is really the opposite of blocked inheritance. It's done on the parent GPO. Anything below must take the GPO setting no matter what, even if it has a blocked inheritance. So going back to what I was just doing, let's say, let me just do block inheritance on the New Jersey. All right. And then I go on the default domain controller. I right click on it and I say enforced. What does that mean? Do you see a little lock, padlock on it? What that means is everybody underneath me have to take my GPO, the default domain controller policy. I don't care if you blocked it or not, New Jersey. You are going to take my GPO settings regardless. That's what you are enforcing it. You are forcing it. You are enforcing everybody underneath, enforcing an inheritance. Okay? So that's what that means. So right click on that, and I want you to take a shot of this, showing me the padlock, the explanation mark, and the enforce. So knowing how to do this exception. All right, when you're done taking the picture, unclick this and unclick the block inheritance. All right, let's take a look at another exception. The other exception is security filtering. Security filtering is, that means if you want to do further filtering on whose GPO will take effect or exclude either group or a user from a GPO that is being applied. So let's say you have a whole bunch of GPOs that are taking effect. You can pick and choose which ones you want to apply, even though you have a whole bunch of them that are hitting you at the same time. You can say, all right, I only want this GPO to be applied and the other and just ignore. Or I can say, all right, these GPOs, I don't want user XYZ to have any effect on these GPOs because he's the administrator, he's a supervisor. I don't want the GPOs that are attached, that are linked to this container to have effect. That's what security filtering is. Okay, so if you want to do security filtering, Let's see. Let me just go in there. And you can go to, let me go to security objects. I go to the new O, and it's right here. Now you can say I want it for all authenticated users. Well, you know what? Let me remove all authenticated users, and let me add. Let's say I want this not to affect Mike Smith. Let's say, right? So I can click on Mike Smith. Can only apply to the following group or users. So this is going to only apply to Mike Smith, right? If I wanted to. There's no DMI. So you could do it right in here if you wanted to. Or if you don't want, okay, let me just remove this. That's if you only apply it to Mike Smith or a group of people in that container or computers if you wanted to. Now, otherwise, you can, if let's say you want to delegate it, you can delegate it to Mike Smith. And when you go to advanced, you can actually pick and choose. You can say, all right, apply this group policy denied. When you click on denied, that means Mike will not get the GPO settings will not apply to Mike Smith. So here's two things that you need to know. You go to delegation if you want a specific user or group not to be applied. If the group is not in here, by the way, you add them, right? And then you go to private to advance, and you click on deny apply group policy. So you go to delegation if you do not want the GPO to be applied to a specific group or user, right? Let me just hit cancel because I don't want that to happen. And let me just go back to scope, and then you go to security filtering if you want it to only be applied to Mike or a group and not to everybody else. You see that difference? All right, once you have in there, please take a snap picture of this so I know that you know how to set the new exception, the security filtering. All right. All right, so let me just remove this and let me bring back authenticated users because I don't want to screw things up. I'll just click on add, and I don't want to be locked out of anything. So write AUTH. Okay, I want the authenticated users. We're back to where we are, and we're good to go. And the last, oh, there's the WMI filtering. This is really for hardware, and we talked about that already. So going back in here, this is where you do the WMI filtering. As you can see, there's nothing in there. This is, again, it's only for the hardware. So apply this GPO if the hardware meets the following specification, for example. Okay, the last exception, the last group policy exceptions that I want to talk about is the loop processing mode. And what that means is that if there's a setting on an object, a setting in the object itself, that's what it is. It has been around since Windows 2000. Deciding on which GPO is going to be implemented. You don't have to follow the LSDOU. When a group policy object is enabled on a computer, we're not going to use that GPO that is linked to the container. So what the user, where the user is, but we will follow loopback GP. So if there's a user in there somewhere, you say, well, I'm not going to follow whatever those GPOs on there. I'm going to go to the loopback processing mode GPO, and I'm going to follow whatever the setting is in there. I'm just going to ignore whatever is in the is in that container or the GPO that's on me. That's only if that's enabled. Okay. This is a little bit trickier. Sometimes it's even harder to do, believe it or not. So let me see. You can, let me go to domain, and we'll go to, let me see, click on all settings. We go settings. We can show all for that one. Right click and what am I doing? Hold on a second. Just give me 1 second, guys. And I'm just going to pause it and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. I just wanted to make sure I don't wanted you to wait while I was looking for that specific setting. So here's what you need to get the loop back uh, processing mode setting. You go to computer configuration, go to the administrative template, and you go to all setting. You either can click on all setting and you can try to find it. It's in here somewhere. Um, but to be honest with you, you got to look for it. And if I'm not mistaken, let me see if it's, the best thing to do then, if you can't find it, I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to filter and actually not filter on. I'm going to right click and let's do the filter options. And nope, that's not it. Trying to find it's in here someplace. Okay. Filter on and you can say loop. Whoops, sorry about that. It's called where is it? Oh man, it's in here someplace. See how many you can tell how many actual allow scripting. There's the extended and the standard ones. Okay, we don't need that. Let's just leave it on the extended. Um, anyway, I'm not gonna. It's gonna take a long time to really, but it's in here someplace. I wanted to show you, and let me pause this again, and once I find it, I'll get back to you. So this way, we don't waste too much time. Okay, we're back. Here we go. So this is where you actually find it. It's called Configure User Group Policy Loopback Processing Mode, and where you can find it is this is the setting. You have to go to Computer Configuration, click on Policy, and then click on Administrative Templates, go to System, and then after System you go to Group Policy down here, and just scroll down till you find Configure User Group Policy Loopback Processing Mode. Okay, let me double click on that. Okay, so this is the actual setting. This is the actual setting for that GPO. So if I you can read and they tell you exactly how this happens. If you enable it, you have a choice. You're saying, I want to replace whatever the GPO that's applied to that user. Okay, so if I apply this exception, um, whatever is being inherited to me or whatever, forget it. Just take whatever this setting is and apply that. Or you could do merge if you wanted to. Merge meaning take the other GPOs that are being applied on me and merge it with this setting together. If there's a conflict, the loopback wins. Okay? That's I mean, it's a little bit complication. This is probably a little bit advanced but it's not advanced, you'll know it. All right, so take a picture of this. This will be our last and final print screen. And this is, believe it or not, ends. Hopefully, you have a better understanding of our GPOs, right? And you can apply them. Again, there's a lot of information in here. I mean, you just need to play around with it for weeks, in fact, and get to and testing it. We didn't do any really testing. We just really on the server side, and we didn't actually do any testing. And it's probably to do a lot of this in a lab environment before you go live. Do your settings, do your GPOs, and have a test client to see if everything's working all right before you link these GPOs that are in here, right? If before you link them. So let me just go back to the domain, and you can lift the test GPO. Okay, so that ends the lesson for GPO. So until next time, it's been 45 minutes. Well, I'm not going to talk anymore. So until the next lesson, I'll talk to you later.